is sort of focus a bit on the two different special cases of the aggregate supply curve. So those two ends, right? The Keynesian range and the classical range. Now, I'm going to start with the classical range, right? First off, you might be wondering, why is it called classical? Well, the reason why it's called classical is that this is what almost all economists thought supply looked like prior to the 1920s. Every economist that was out there, basically this is what we said. We said, oh, aggregate supply is always this vertical line. Basically what they were saying was that prior to 1920, we were always at or near full employment. Always. So think 1850s, 1880s, or something like that. If you didn't have a job in the 1880s, what would happen to you? It was a little bit more Darwinian prior to the 1920s. There was no such thing as unemployment. There was no such thing as, welfare. So if you didn't have a job back in the pre-1920s era of the world, if you weren't doing something productive, you tended to be on the way out the door, okay? It's a bit on the Darwinian side, so maybe a little grim, but that was really the way they thought about it, right? They basically said everybody is working all the time. So here was our aggregate demand. So the question then is, would there ever be recessions in this kind of a world? Well, yeah, I mean, there were still bills in the 1800s, but how did they work, okay? Here's how it worked, right? So classical economists assume we are always near, and again, near is a hand-wavy thing, near full employment. And a lot of times this concept of being fully employed was more along the lines of a family unit instead of an individual unit, right? So you could have a family that had to have at least someone being employed in the family so that the family could survive, right? So there were people who were unemployed, but through their unemployment, they were getting, survival needs through someone who was working, all right? So when we enter a recession, aggregate demand falls. So recessions generally start because of aggregate demand falling. Tends to be the way they work most of the time. Not always the case, though. And we'll talk about those in a little bit. So when aggregate demand falls, what happens to the classical economists is they say, oh, here is where our CPI used to be, right? Our prices are basically sitting here. When aggregate demand falls, GDP drops for a little while, okay? So production drops for a little while. But the key here is realizing, think 1880s, 1850s again, right? You're running, say, a grocery store. In the 1850s, did they have big, huge refrigerators and massive warehouses to store all of our goods? No. So when demand fell for your products in your store and people quit buying them, what did you have to do as a store owner? We didn't understand composting yet back then either. We were getting on it. What would we do? I mean, what would we do with the food that was sitting around in our shelves? Or, I mean, we would have to sell it, right? I mean, because if you didn't sell it, you got nothing for it. So in order to sell things that normally you wouldn't sell, what do you have to have? Sales. Right. So you have a sale. You basically say, look, instead of it being, 10 cents a pound for flour, it's now going to be 5 cents a pound for flour, right? Because if you leave a bag of flour that's not in an airtight sealed room, what's going to happen? You get mice, you get weevils, you get bugs in your flour. There's nothing more creepy than opening a bag of flour and seeing eggs, basically. My grandma had she had a room in the backyard, right? That was where you put most of the bags of stuff, and you'd have to go back there, and if there were any of the bags that had things in them, you had to... Anyways, so the key here is realizing that whenever aggregate demand falls, in order to clear inventory, businesses lower prices. Now, the other key to the way things worked back in the 1850s and 1880s and times like that is that back then we were a little bit more unionistic in our design of business. Businesses did almost all of their income through profit sharing, right? When the store got money, you as a worker in the store got a certain percentage of every sale that happened, period. That's how it worked. So if the store could sell flour at 10 cents a pound, you as the stock boy got 1 penny a pound. The cashier boy who, bagged the flour or carried the flour for them got 2 cents a pound. The person who cleaned the place got 2 cents a pound, and then the rest went to the owner, right? It was all very tied to your own sales. So if prices go down, what happens to the income of all the workers? Goes down with it, right? As sales, as dollar amount of sales falls. Please note that sales stay roughly the same, right? The actual quantity of goods that they're buying and selling stays roughly the same. And again, the reason why is that you as a store owner, you know how many people are in your city or your community, and you buy enough food and materials to feed and house and take care of that community. That's the way it worked, right? I mean, it was a lot more communal than you would think, right? We've always screamed, America, we have to be independent. It's like, bullshit, we'd be dead. Pre-1940s, if that were the case, this country would have never survived, right? As dollar amount of sales falls, incomes fall as well. And so the key here is that as prices start to fall, what happens to our production? Well, at least we're selling stuff, and now we start to see that demand starts creeping up. It's not that it's the demand is creeping up, but the quantity that we purchase creeps up. As long as we creep up our purchasing, wages will creep up with it as well, right? But basically what happens is that as those people lose money, the salespeople lose money, the incomes drop with it, the prices drop with it, and we will get back to full employment. So classical economists assumed that there would be recessions, but they would be very short-lived because basically flexible prices would all drop, and as prices dropped, so would incomes drop, and once they all sort of leveled out, we would be right back at full employment. And it would work the other way too. If aggregate demand grew, again, we would see that since people at the current price levels, what would the store owners do when everybody bought everything out? They wouldn't buy more because they couldn't get more. Shipping was really, really hard, right? Think 1850s. There wasn't a car on every street, right? They would have to try and order more. They couldn't necessarily order more, so what they would do is just start raising prices. And as prices rise, and individuals earn a little bit more because of the increasing prices, the fact of the matter was that the ratio of wages to prices stayed roughly the same almost all the time. So yeah, there would be periods of growth which would usually be leading into higher inflation, higher prices, and then there would be recessions where the prices would drop and everything would still get sold, okay? The big thing about this classical stage was that businesses had to sell everything and workers had to work. If you didn't work, you were gone. Right? If there wasn't at least one person working in your family was going to be removed from the situation. Put it however you like. It was a very grim, reality of life back in pre-1920s era. And so classical economists basically, came up with this great explanation of why is the economy always going to be essentially working at full employment. This is what Adam Smith came up with initially back in the 1800s. Was this design of how does supply and demand shift based on, the cycles of the business, because he recognized that there were business cycles, but at the same time he noticed pretty much people were always working. Right? So, classical econ. Basically what classical economists state was that full employment is always close and will be reached with flexible wages and prices. So as long as we can allow wages and prices to fluctuate together, we will always be at or near full employment. That's a very classical economic argument. And it's what has been being used for, literally millennia, right? And in theory, if we allowed our economy to work this way right now, if our businesses were set up such that the workers were paid as a proportion of the sales that are made directly, this could work. Straight up. There's nothing that says if we could somehow make it happen that workers in a business would get paid based on the amount of sales that business made, that this would be a perfectly acceptable way of things working. And the nice part about it is that if prices go up, so do your wages. If prices go down, so do your wages. You'll always be able to afford everything you need, because if you start to lose money, prices will go down with it. Would that be such a bad thing? Mm-hmm. What? Yeah. Yeah, it's not a bad idea, right? Why doesn't it work today, though? When a business sells a whole lot of goods and makes a whole lot of profit, who gets most of the money? The business tends to get money, and does the business have to worry about when it makes sales, right? Nah, not really, right? The business can store goods as long as they need to. Even if you're in the produce market, you can hang on to goods forever, right? That's what refrigerators allow us to do. Used to be as soon as you got milk, you had to sell it within 4 days or it was gone. It was, Nowadays, you can refrigerate it and pasteurize it and make it last for months. And if you package it correctly, you can actually make milk last, have a shelf life that's years. Mm-hmm. Why would a company care whether or not they sell things quick or not? The only people who would care then would be those workers who were getting paid based on how many sales they made. And okay, so it could work, and it's not a bad thing. It would be awesome if we could have it, live that way or have it work that way. The problem is that certain markets don't fit this mold well. What am I selling? How do I determine how much I should make based on how much you guys make? So, if I educate you well enough and you get a job, are you going to constantly send me money forever? because I educated you so that you could work? If I could continually suck off of you guys for the rest of life, yes! That would just, you guys would probably all just become bums and sit around and do nothing just to piss me off, wouldn't you? All right, so again, this is the classical economist's view of the world, okay? Is don't worry about employment. It's not something you have to mess with because it'll come back if you just let it, right? But the key to it, and this is really the key, are these things, the flexible wages and prices. And unfortunately in today's society, wages and prices are not flexible in any way, shape, or form, right? I mean, if you get a pay cut nowadays, what do? I mean, you scream bloody murder, right? And if prices go up, what are you doing? You're going, God, I'm also screaming bloody murder, right? I mean, but there's not a whole lot you can do about it. Unless you can quit and find a new job, right? All right, so classical economists, there are still classical economists out there, right? These people who are calling for less government intervention, they tend to be more along the lines of these types of economists who think that really prices and wages should be way more flexible than they are right now. And if we would let them be more flexible, the economy would take care of itself better. We wouldn't need the government to step in and constantly fix stuff, right? Again, though, if you don't have the government in there, I don't know how flexible those wages would be if the people had to fight with the businesses. Don't know if it could work. All right, well, this is the way economics was all the way up until the 1930s. And then we had the Great Depression. And that changed everything. Now, up to the 30s, businesses were just starting to figure out how to handle this ability to store goods and refrigerate goods. I mean, it was really just starting in the 30s, and so they really hadn't learned how to maximize their profit yet at that stage. All right, most of what businesses were doing back then were basically trying to kill competition and become monopolies. That was their goal, right? It wasn't until basically the Roaring 20s that businesses figured out how to say how I can make more money by learning how to do research and development. Granted, it was being done at universities and not at businesses as much, but they started to use the knowledge that was being garnered. So during the Great Depression, President Hoover, he was a classical economist, and all of his advisors were classical economists, okay? So he thought, or they thought, that aggregate supply was this straight up and down curve, all right? And so when we had the start of the Great Depression, the start of it was that aggregate demand started to drop, right? That's the way almost all recessions start. So aggregate demand fell. Now, Herbert Hoover, the erstwhile genius of a president who probably couldn't string two sentences together if he tried, got elected from money. Came from a lot of money. Anyways, his reaction to this particular recession, right? Now remember, he was a classical economist. So he assumed that what happens when there's a drop in aggregate demand? What's going to start happening very soon after that? What's going to start? We're going to start traveling along this new aggregate demand curve to a new equilibrium point, and GDP is going to be staying the same, but what's going to happen? Prices are going to fall, right? So 1930s, Hoover sees aggregate demand fall and expects prices and wages to fall with it. It's just natural, because that's the way the classical economic world has always worked. So Hoover, who is president, what he has to do is balance the budget, right? That's his job. He's the president. Really, that's all he had to do. So if wages are going to fall, how is the government going to be able to pay for everything if everybody's wages are cut, say, like 10%? Hoover's the president. He's got to pay for, like, the Army and the Navy and all of the different government. There weren't a whole lot of government organizations. There was really the only thing the government did was paid for the people who were elected and for running the Army. That was about it, right? So when you see that people's wages are going to drop, in order to have enough money to pay for your army, what do you have to do? I mean, how do you collect money as a government? Taxes. And you tax people based on a percentage, right? But if all of their wages are going to go down, what happens to your collections? They go down. So what do you have to do in order to collect more money? Increase the taxes a little bit, right? So Hoover raises taxes because he knows he needs to have enough money to pay for the army, and that's really his only job. Now, he didn't raise them a lot, but he raised them enough so that the government would have enough money next year. Unfortunately, what happened when he raised taxes? Did prices fall? No. Businesses had finally discovered that they didn't have to lower prices in order to make sales. They just stored their goods. Didn't worry about it. And when they sold them, great. Who cares where we sell them or when we sell them? As long as we sell them eventually, we'll make money and it's all good. So prices didn't fall. And taxes were raised. So what happened to aggregate demand? What happened to the money that people had to buy stuff? It got worse. So aggregate demand dropped even further due to more taxes. People, i.e. think C, bought less, and aggregate demand fell more. Rinse and repeat this for 2 straight years. And what you discover is that aggregate demand dropped 45 to 50%. Basically because, one, people were getting laid off, so there was less money out there. Businesses were saying, oh, to maximize profit, instead of trying to produce more and sell more, we're going to keep selling what we're selling, but we're just going to keep firing people as we need to. Right? If people quit buying stuff, we're going to fire people so that we don't have to pay for them anymore. Throw this along for 2 years, and you discover that all of a sudden your country's on the verge of collapse. In steps John Maynard Keynes, who says, wait. What you're doing at this stage is you have pushed aggregate demand out of that safe, nice, happy, classical range, and you have shoved it into this range. Or we have created this range where it's now flat demand, or flat supply in this case, because prices aren't going to lower anymore. Once they get low enough, lower than that, prices almost never fall. There's only been 2 instances in the last 100 years where you can find prices falling, right? It was during this Great Depression and during the Great Recession 4 or 5 years ago. They dropped for 1 whole month, 0.2%. So here, Keynes comes up with the new economics. And he comes in, and of course Herbert Hoover gets voted out. Say that really fast. Herbert Hoover. Right. And in steps, oh gosh, who's the New Deal guy? Truman?
What, after Hoover?
Yeah.
Roosevelt.
Oh, Roosevelt was, but no, wasn't Truman? Who created the New Deal? Was that Roosevelt? Was it Roosevelt right after Hoover?
Yeah.
Did we go to World War II right after that? Right, yeah. Okay, so anyways, when we finally got out of this recession, what caused the recession to finally end was that instead of having flexible wages and prices, which had now all of a sudden disappeared, we needed the government to step in to save us. All right? So the lack of flexible wages and prices led to the Depression and the discovery of the Keynesian range. And it was John Maynard Keynes who suggested to the government that instead of raising taxes more in order to fight these drops in aggregate demand, you need to boost it yourself as a government. You need to borrow money. And by borrowing money and spending it or hiring people, those people who work will collect money from you for a little while and generate GDP. And the whole point of them spending GDP is that it gets into the circular flow. And as it flows around, the amount of GDP that it generates will come back to you in taxes 2 to 3 to 4-fold. And that you can actually balance your debt 3 or 4 years down the line because people start working and the recession ends, you recover, and you pay things back. So this is really what led to Keynes discovering this, or coming up with this theory that represented our sort of three-kinked version of the aggregate supply curve that we mostly assume is correct or roughly correct in current economic times. All right? So when demand falls far enough, we can get into that classical range where prices all of a sudden become really sticky. But once aggregate demand gets back into the recovery stage, it kind of works the way you'd expect prices and wages to work. Once we see growth in demand, generally you expect growth in prices with it. All right? All right. So now let's play some games. So again, remember, classical economists believe technically the aggregate supply curve is just straight up and down, and that flexible wages and prices make it all work. All right, so now that we've made it back into the 40s and 50s, assume we are in the recovery stage. And you read that, let's just go with the same thing we were doing before. Government increases spending to go to war or wars. And my question is, how will this affect the three goals? CPI, GDP, employment. So, start with your aggregate supply curve. Where am I going to put aggregate demand? In the intermediate stage. Does it matter where on the intermediate stage you put it? Not really, but it might, based on what ends up happening. So the cool part about this, though, is that you have freedom. In this class, you can put it anywhere you want. I'm okay with it. Let's assume that our recovery is really good and that we're somewhere up here over near full employment. Doesn't really matter in the end, but as long as you start somewhere in the right range, you will always be correct, okay? All right, so now analyze what's happening. Government increases spending. What happens to aggregate demand and aggregate supply? So due to an increase in G, we will expect aggregate demand to grow. That's the whole point of government spending. Aggregate demand shifts to the right. And again, if you shift it all the way into the classical range, cool. If you don't, it's equally as cool. It's okay. All right? Again, though, you should be able to interpret your graph. If I ask you what stage of the economy is in after this is finished, you should tell me, based on where you drew aggregate demand, where we got to. So if you draw your line in the vertical, you had better say we have reached full employment. All right? If you didn't move it there, you could say, oh, we have further recovered. We're not quite at full employment. Okay? So be able to verbally explain the graph that you're drawing. Okay? Because those will be questions that I'll ask. All right, now, again, here was our old equilibrium. That was our CPI and our GDP. We have moved to point. What happened to CPI? CPI rises. What happens to GDP? GDP grows, maybe not as much as we wanted, but as long as we get to full employment, we don't care. GDP rises. And then last but not least, what happens to employment? Right. Employment grows to, for me at least, full. Now, if you didn't make it all the way into the classical stage in your graph, that's fine. Nothing wrong with it. All right? You just tell me that employment grew, and that's enough. And again, you guys would say that this demand pull inflation. Since prices went up, there was inflation, and you need to be able to tell me which type of inflation it was. In this case, since it was demand that was moving, it was demand pull inflation. All right? And note that generally we don't mind demand pull inflation, right? Because generally GDP rises with it. Okay? All right, so let's try another one. Let's keep it in the same thing. So we're in the recovery stage. Period. This time, let's see. So let's suppose that the government starts to get worried about the workforce and decides to, say, create a social security number and wants to track all of the workers. So based on whenever they pay anybody, they have to keep track of what their social security number is and how much they're paying them so that the government knows how much they're making so that when it comes tax time, they can tax them appropriately, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So what did the creation of social security numbers do to the economy? Basically, that's what I'm asking. All right? All right, so here we are. Here's our aggregate supply curve. Throw aggregate demand curve. I'm just going to throw it right in the middle this time. All right. Increased government regulation. What does that do? Yes, decreases aggregate supply. So increased regulation, spell it right, reduces aggregate supply, right? More regulation means that businesses have to spend more time filling out forms instead of working, right? Producing. So aggregate supply shifts left. So we shift our aggregate supply to the left. Again, try and keep everything parallel if at all possible. And then compare your two equilibriums. Here's where we were. Here's where we are. So, what happened to CPI? Increased CPI, right? CPI rises. Bummer. What happened to GDP? Oh boy. GDP falls. What happens to employment then? What the? This is what's called the double whammy, folks. Right? It's the double screw, because you have higher prices and you've got less GDP. Right? If you were elected during this time, guess what? Bye-bye. At this stage, if you are increasing government regulations, you are almost always doing it during a wartime period, because then you have such huge growth in aggregate demand that it makes up for all of the decrease in aggregate supply. All right? You will note that generally more regulations come around when there is war. And it's because the loss in aggregate supply that you would see in GDP is completely absorbed by the growth in aggregate demand from war. War is a really great thing. Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, we weren't in a huge recession during Bush. Yeah, the recession was at the start of Bush, and that's why he was deregulating and going to war, to push both of those things up.
I have fried treats from Kedron for you to please let me interrupt your class and give this to Grant Webster.
Okay. Oh, that's fine with me. So, at the beginning of the Bush presidency, there was recession, but that was because of freak, right? The whole bizarreness that led to the start of his reign. But then, in order to get out of it, he was pushing for war and pushing for deregulation, because both of those things are going to deregulation shift the aggregate supply to the right, and increase government spending, which shifts aggregate demand to the right. That's the double bonus. Those are both good. Because the increase in aggregate supply will actually grow GDP and decrease prices, which, I mean, that's, anytime you can have that happen, you dance all the way to the bank and get reelected. Even if you say nuclear. I love GW. All right, so, and again, folks, we have inflation. What kind of inflation is this? Cost push. Note that you get cost push inflation sometimes not because your resources prices rise, but really it can also come from higher regulation or higher taxation or, a reduction of subsidies, the same sort of thing. Basically what it's saying is that the cost of doing business rose because you have to keep track of Social Security numbers. Good or bad? That's one of those tough ones, right? I mean, it's really nice having a Social Security number, folks, and having a way to track everything that is you. But, of course, if you can track everything that is you, you will be tracked. No, I agree. Yeah. Well, I mean, the biggest issue with the Social Security numbers was guaranteeing government revenue. Since we had gotten to that stage where government is a player in the macroeconomy, they needed a way to guarantee that, to measure how much they could count on in revenue. And that's sort of been a big issue since then. It's made government work, in theory, tons better. Again, define better however you wish. Yeah. All right, so, let's stay in the recovery stage. And let's do Bill Clinton this time. Businesses discover the new technology called computer. So one of the things that Clinton did was to reap the rewards of basically Ronald Reagan, who pushed for businesses to install computers into their industry. Right? It was Reagan who really started all of this. He said, hey guys, let's get computers in the office. He was the first one that gave government subsidies and kickbacks to lots of companies who started using the computer to do their business. All right? So for a while there, Reagan reaped a lot of the rewards too, because he was considered an amazing president too. And one of his things was paying for research and development. Right? Businesses today, still, every dollar that they spend on research and development, taken out of their taxes instantly. Period. Right? If your job is R&D, so suppose you go work for a company where you're writing computer code. All of that new computer code you write, that's research and development. Every penny they pay you, it's a tax deduction for that company. Companies love that, right? I mean, Judy up in Epic Land in Madison, she hardly pays any taxes at all, folks, because she takes all of the money that she pays all of her programmers and writes it off, because it's all research and development. At least on her federal corporate taxes. She still has to pay the city of Verona. But she doesn't mind. Verona's been very good to her. So, let's see what this does. So, let's keep ourselves in the middle of the recovery stage. Granted, there were a few dark spots in the Clinton era where aggregate demand was actually falling once they sort of hit that initial bonus from the computers world. But Clinton was clever enough to figure a few things out while he was going along. Now, new technology. What does new technology always do? Increases supply, right? So for us, new technology increases aggregate supply. So, aggregate supply shifts to the right. Here's a good example of aggregate supply shifting to the right. Keep things parallel again. Note that when I turn my kink, it's at the same spot, the same height. And really, you want to push the Keynesian range over a little bit. So, here's where I was, right? This was my price level and my GDP. What happened to prices? CPI falls, stabling out prices, life is good. What happens to GDP? Oh yeah, the Holy Grail, folks. What comes along with rising GDP? Employment rises with it. Again, bear with me to some degree, right? This employment rise may be delayed. It'll lag, especially with new technology, right? Because a lot of times what happens is that new technology gets a whole bunch of people laid off. They have to go and get retrained. Once they get retrained, they'll get rehired back into the new economy that is being generated by the new technology, in theory, right? Again, knock on some wood. So growing aggregate supply, folks, is almost always a bonus, okay? Almost always. And you always get the double bonus with it. Falling CPI and rising GDP. Again, this always gets you reelected, period. Bush, Clinton, doesn't matter what party you're in, you sing and dance all the way to the bank. You could think of it like that. But they really don't name any of the deflation or disinflation activities. Yeah. It's only noticed if there's a bad thing happening, period, right? That means the same thing with a recession, right? We talk about recessions because GDP is falling. We don't talk about booms too terribly much because GDP is rising. We just kind of say, oh, it's normal. Because we assume that we should always be growing, right? Whatever. Okay. So we are in a recession. You read that imports are falling. What do you expect to happen in the economy? And the reason why I make you guys do so many of these examples is because when it comes time to the test, you are going to be able to draw the aggregate supply curve correctly, period. Right, Joe? Yes. We will be able to do dink, dink, dink in our sleep. All right, where am I going to put aggregate demand this time? On the Keynesian range. And since I didn't say nasty depression, you could probably put it somewhere close to the kink, all right? The more heavily worded any one of these phrases are, the more you should move aggregate demand appropriately. So if it's a recession, recessions are a part of the cycle. You will sometimes get down in this range. But if I said it was a nasty depression, you probably want to move it, even further over to the left. Again, it's not crucial, but that's the idea behind it. All right. Imports are falling. Good. Imports. Remember, imports are, right, they're bad for aggregate demand. So if we have less imports, what happens to aggregate demand? Yes. So less imports equals more AD. Woohoo! So we shift aggregate demand to the right. And again, it's kind of up to you how far you shift your aggregate demand curve. If you had your aggregate demand curve, further over on the Keynesian range and you didn't move it out of the recession area, that's fine. Nothing wrong with it, okay? Just make sure that you say what your graph shows, okay? So the issue with the aggregate or with the macro side of things is that your graph is actually now more important than the words. In the micro world, the words in the graph were kind of equals. Here, it's a little bit more important to have your graph and your words in sync, all right? And that's because we've sort of skipped the surplus shortage stage at this level. So here's where I was. Here's where I am. What happened to CPI? It went up. So CPI rose. And here I'm going to say a little. Because it wasn't as much. Because there was some growth in that aggregate demand stage. It was growing through the recession. It wasn't making prices rise. But they did go up some. All right. What happened to GDP? GDP rises. It rises a decent amount. And, of course, what comes with a rise in GDP? Employment falls. Again, you can do it either way. Say employment or say unemployment. Just make sure you write the right thing. All right. Any questions on graphing in the aggregate demand and supply or the macro world? We'll be able to crank these out? All right. That is chapter 14. Again, please note the two stages where you get inflation from, the demand pull and the cost push, and how they work. I sort of went through those examples as a part of the graphing world, but they're there, and I want to make sure that you guys remember that we talked about them, because it's still an important thing to have in the back of your head. All righty. At that note, homework, sorry. Oh, you got a break for homework for chapter 14. 2, 4, 8, and 10, is that what I said? Yeah. Flips pages, right? Don't worry about the, well, yeah. 309 and 310. Yep. There is an appendix to chapter 14. The appendix is basically explaining that classical range of aggregate supply. That's what I was started with. Joe, turn me off. Thanks.